Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending this panel, and thanks also to the organizers of this online conference. I'm recording because there's a lot going on in this part of the world, and I'm hoping that this will help secure some form of my participation. Cannabis in South Africa is also called dagga. And my guess is that most of you will know that this plant has a long history of indigenous uses here, and that the political impulse to control cannabis really only took shape in the early 20th century. I want to just say here that my story is about racist ideas and about teasing out different threads of those ideas because of the consequences they have had and also continue to have. So it's uncomfortable material to work with, and I want to alert you to that. Here is where we are in the world. My focus today is part of a larger project on the politics of cannabis control in South Africa, which is characterized by a paradox of white minority rule. And that paradox was this: colonial politics in the 20th century was founded on racial and cultural segregations and spatial divisions. These mapped out partitions of territory to facilitate the indirect rule of majority Black populations through the agency of so-called tribal or traditional authorities. The boundaries of these reservations, which were later called ethnic homelands, were formalized in 1913 by the Natives Land Act. As it concerns our story, the effect was that the white racial state essentially created a patchwork economic periphery of Black labor reserves that were increasingly impoverished and which became important in the unfolding development of a thriving cannabis economy. Following the prohibition of cannabis in 1922, the commercial cultivation of dagga emerged within a number of these rural spaces, grown by poor farmers, and then moved into the new markets of towns, cities, and workplaces that were populated or controlled by white settlers. So to sum up this paradox, on the one hand, into the 20th century, we have a state with modernist aspirations, increasingly at pains to demonstrate its drug control commitments. On the other hand, that same state continues to promote the very conditions of segregation and geographical partitioning in which cannabis is commoditized and developed into a substantial agribusiness. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale and what was at stake in the material and political expression of this paradox, also and the conflicts that it generated, I found the data from the United Nations in the period in which apartheid policy and its war on cannabis was beginning, the 1950s. And this data on seizures as a percentage of the world total of cannabis seizures shows us two realities about South Africa. First is that the region is, by this time, by the mid-century, it's become an important cannabis growing region. Secondly, it's that the South African government appears to stand out among signatory states in its comparative determination to control cannabis as a dangerous drug. So we have in 1951, we have South Africa accounting for 76% of the recorded amount of dagga seized. Now, so far, I've framed this paradox in very instrumentalist terms. But understanding the origins of this paradox requires that we also look to the specific ideas about dagga and dagga smoking, and also about smokers of dagga within colonial thinking and speaking. So what did those who claimed expertise say about the intoxicating spaces that I'm abbreviating here? I'm calling it town and country. I'm going to consider the writing of two individuals who in different ways reflected and influenced colonial thinking and strategy, and who help to highlight its contradictions. The first was written in 1913 by Charles John George Borhill, submitted as a research thesis to the University of Edinburgh for the degree of medical doctor, and it was entitled The Smoking of Dacha, Indian Hemp, Among the Native Races of South Africa and the Resultant Evils. The second piece of writing came out of the office of John Alexander Mitchell, who in 1924, as the Minister of Public Health, published a memorandum on Dacha abuse and its evils. So I'm treating these documents as primary sources which reveal the ways that knowledge about Dacha smoking was ethnographically constructed in distinctive ways for the spaces of town and country. Both of these individuals were medical doctors. They wrote 10 years apart and from different positions and for different purposes. And each of these documents had a fairly wide circulation. Our first writer is Charles Borhill, who was born in 1885 in Kimberley, where he also completed his schooling. He was medically trained in Edinburgh, graduating with a bachelor's degree in medicine and surgery in 1910. And a commemorative yearbook shows that he was active in his cohort. He made honors rolls in both experimental and chemical physiology. And after graduation, he took up internships at infirmaries in Banbury and Edinburgh. And in 4 letters of recommendation, he was commended as a committed, able, and affable young doctor. In 1912, he was headhunted to take up a post at the Pretoria Lunatic Asylum, an institution later known as Weskoppies Mental Health Hospital. It had been established in 1892 in the period of the Kruger Republic to provide the latest enlightened treatment. It was managed initially by a specialist from Scotland and then by one from Holland, and the facility treated Black as well as white patients, both men and women, all in separate wards. Now, it appears that during the South African War of 1899 and 1902, the asylum was taken over by British forces, and there are hints that it was utilized for war concerns. High mortality rates, reports of escapes by Dutch-speaking residents specifically, and the destruction of records in this period may point to why the government later sought to reform Weskoppies' public reputation. It seems that the recruitment of Charles Borhill as a new medical graduate from Edinburgh was part of that effort. I was able to retrieve Borhill's HR file from Pretoria, and it seems that his passage by both sea and rail were paid by the government in advance with the understanding that he learned Dutch and fulfill a 3-year contract of service. So Borhill took up his duties at the end of May in 1912, but less than 4 months later, in mid-September, he requested to be released from that position on grounds both that he had no aptitude for the clinical work of an asylum, and also that he had been led to expect that his role would be actually in pathology and bacteriology. So he only remained 8 months in the post, after which he went off to work as a medical officer for the coal mining compounds in Witbank, 100 kilometers east of Pretoria. Just to finish up the story, in 1916, Borehill signed up for service in the First World War. He served as a medic. He emigrated to England after that, and he settled into a practice in Warrington, and he died in 1970. So it was during and also following his months in the Pretoria Asylum that he apparently occupied himself in his research on Dacha smoking and the phenomenon of Dacha insanity. The second medical figure whose work I'm examining was J. Alexander Mitchell. And he was born in Ireland in 1876. His medical training, like Borhill's, was Scottish, with a bachelor's degree in medicine and surgery from the University of Glasgow in 1898, and a diploma in tropical medicine from Edinburgh. Mitchell was hired as a government bacteriologist in the Cape Colony from 1899. He did leprosy research on Robben Island, and in that first decade, he was put in charge of quarantines during epidemics of the plague. With the Union of South Africa in 1910, Mitchell was appointed as the Union's assistant medical officer based in Cape Town, and then he advanced to the role of public health minister in 1919. So he served in that role just before his death by heart attack in 1933. So it was in this capacity of health minister that his 1924 pamphlet was circulated nationally. And a few years later, the League of Nations distributed that document internationally, and whole portions of it were reprinted or quoted at length in newspapers based, for example, in Cairo, London, Cape Town, and various cities of the United States. So what was the content of these respected documents, and how did they construct the intoxicating spaces of town and country in relation to dacha smoking? Well, there's quite a good deal one can say about Borhill's thesis, about many aspects of this work. And some of my colleagues today present will have written about it also. So my focus here is narrow and specific. As I mentioned, the racism of Borhill's writing makes this trigger warning territory. But reading even within that grain, it's clear that part of his work was directed to countering the so-called Black Peril public panics that were at this time circulating in white settler communities. And he specifically rejected the idea of cannabis, that cannabis was a factor in sexual crimes and in the rape of white women by Black men specifically. He was also clear about the lack of evidence for cannabis as a causal factor in violent crime and theft. And a portion of his thesis argues that the effects of cannabis were shaped by social environment and individual personality and physiology. So, for example, he wrote, "After watching a party of natives smoking, a spectator is at once struck by two facts. Firstly, that the mental and physical results are not dependent upon the amount of fumes inhaled, but on the individual himself, his nervous organization, his disposition, his character, and his temperament. Secondly, that the effects of the drug vary greatly, both in kind and degree, among different smokers." So his reification of race and tribe does not preclude him from observing the variation of effect, which as a medical doctor appeared to have fascinated him the most. For Borhill, the evils of dacha smoking were not located in dacha as a substance, nor in the smoking of dacha by so-called native races. The first part of his thesis includes his attempt to explain the customary methods of cannabis smoking common in the region. And they're illustrated with diagrams of local pipe technologies. And these may possibly be his own artwork. So the evil in his title does not for him generally point to customary indigenous uses. In fact, for Borhill, the evil of dacha smoking is rather related to what he saw as a clash between ontologies of culture and historical change. And in his proposed etiology of dacha insanity, Borhill described the site of employment, respectively either in country or town, as a powerful variable. This was because, as he said, in country districts, A native pursues the even tenor of his ways without feeling much stress or strain of life. Whereas in those spaces he referred to as civilization, quote, the struggle for existence is keen, money is an object to be striven for, the vices of white men are an example to be followed, ambitions are fostered, work is hard, and hours are long, and there are the police to be avoided. So Borhill's perspective on intoxicating spaces promoted one popular colonial view of segregation. This was rooted in a lament for the detribalizing native male subject and his entry into towns for industrial work. And Borhill put it this way: leave the raw savage in his primitive state, leading his own life. Let him smoke dacha when and how he pleases, and it will be found that little or no harm will result. But take a young native with his stunted mental powers, place him in abnormal surroundings, educate him beyond his intellectual capacity, give him hard and unnatural work to perform, let him become ambitious to copy the white man and outshine his fellows. Now introduce the vices: alcohol, dacha, unnatural sex practices, etc. What is the result? The interaction of environment and vice proves too much for many. The feebler brain drops out of flight, shattered and broken. 10 years after Borhill's thesis and following cannabis prohibition laws in the Union, the Minister of Health, J. Alexander Mitchell, produced his pamphlet, his memorandum on dacha abuse and its evils. The purpose of this document was to raise alarm about dacha smoking in urban residential spaces, workplaces, and in educational institutions, and specifically dacha smoking by white people, white youth in particular, and by colored people, people of mixed ancestry. And in these spaces, and by these people, Mitchell characterized dacha smoking as a eugenics disaster with the effects of race degeneration and interracial social mixing. Yet, although he portrayed cannabis smoking in the town as both the cause and consequence of social leveling between white, black, and brown people, Mitchell painted quite a different picture of dacha in the countryside. And there were three reasons he put forth why native uses of cannabis within rural traditional homesteads did not lead to insanity, violence, or worker debility. First, he claimed, the dacha in these spaces was botanically different. It was, quote, not usually Indian hemp, unquote, at all, but rather the free-ranging and plant that was devoid of intoxicant alkaloids, one or more of the species of Leonotus, which was an indigenous plant. Secondly, the regulatory influence of tribal social relations were overseen by traditional patriarchal forms of authority, thus preventing excessive use. And this stood in contrast for Mitchell to the heavy consumption in the alienating conditions of the modern workspace. And he did use the word alienating, interestingly. Finally, the manner of dacha smoking also mattered. So Mitchell wrote that formerly, dacha smokers usually made deliberate preparations for indulging in the drug and inhaled smoke through water contained either in a specific constructed pipe or in their mouths, or they made a little cavity in clayey soil to serve as a pipe bowl, with the channel communicating with another hole a yard or so away, through which the smoke was sucked. Ordinary tobacco pipes and cigarettes are now often used for smoking the drug, either alone or mixed with tobacco. What seems evident in these explanations also is that the intelligence conveyed was filtered through Native Affairs Department officials from elite African interlocutors. Some of these ideas about cannabis were indeed conveyed by African dacha smokers themselves, and it suited them that rural spaces be exempted from policing under the recent prohibitionist law. So Dacha legislation was in practice deferred by colonial officials and passed along to traditional authorities for its regulation. And to this end, I think I'm going to skip this part. Let's just say to end. In this presentation, I reflected on how documents produced by Charles Borhill in 1913 and by Alexander Mitchell in 1924 provide insights into a developing paradox of cannabis control within colonial and later apartheid white rule. Dacha smoking, which was condemned as a dangerous evil in the city, was long tolerated as a customary tonic or intoxicant in the countryside. Borhill's perspective was that Dacha and the people smoking Dacha should remain untouched by time in their rural and customary domains. And Dacha sanity was a problem of people out of place. Mitchell, 10 years later, rather sought to prohibit dacha in urban areas altogether. And given that the economy was extremely dependent upon Black African labor, he projected the problem not so much as people out of place, but as substance or matter out of place. He was very careful not to suggest that dacha prohibition be enforced in those intoxicating spaces where it would defy the authority of African chiefs and kings, those people who held together and stabilized colonial segregation and its geographies. And this, paradoxically, supported the conditions in which dacha was, over the next decades, historically transformed from a kitchen garden crop for customary use into a lucrative agribusiness. And in the apartheid period, the dacha economy, nurtured through these colonial geographies of segregation, became the target of a punishing war on drugs. I think I will end on that note, a grim note indeed, but thanks everyone.